Okay, so we'll open the floor to the audience. We'll take 3 questions at a time, and again, please keep it brief.
So on this question of Jewish indigeneity, I think, it's very inventive. And I think, it's very important that we talk about what the terms actually are. Israel is a state. It's a modern state, and it needs to be judged on the standards of modern statehood. And it needs to be held accountable to the same standards that we hold any other state. And so I think the attempt to sort of, it's often tried to be recast as a religious conflict, and it's often tried to be recast as a question of, again, like Jewish peoplehood and rights to the land. But I think we need to make sure that we're continuing to be very precise about the terms that we're using, what we're talking about, in the same way that we want to hold the U.S. accountable to all of its violations and all the ways that it is needs to be protested and changed. In the same way, Israel needs to be held to the same standards, and it's about state and state power that's being used to dispossess and oppress, and what we can do to change that.
I just want to say very briefly that white Afrikaners in South Africa made similar claims about being the first ones in the land, and they created a mythology around, yes they did, they created a mythology that the area was unpopulated when they first landed there in the 1600s.
The question on building Palestinian governmental institutions in the occupied West Bank goes well beyond my expertise, but one thing I do know, that should not be a smokescreen that covers up colonization and occupation. Regarding the second question about how can a Palestinian citizen or resident of Israel go to an Israeli university and at the same time I heard you, so hear me, and at the same time call for a boycott of Israeli institutions. Interesting. Mandela did the same thing. He went to an apartheid university, yet called for a full boycott of apartheid South Africa. Gandhi did the same thing, studied at a British Imperial University, and called for boycotting the empire. You may have missed the last part of my presentation, but I was saying, explaining the difference between coercive and voluntary relationships. When you are living under a system of apartheid, you do not choose the institutions of apartheid that oppress you. Palestinians did not emigrate to an apartheid Israel and ask for their rights. It's an apartheid Israel that was imposed on us. So it's not like we have a lot of choices which institutions to deal with. Health institutions, educational institutions, all kind of government institutions. However, calling on others who do have a choice to boycott those same institutions is quite altruistic because it comes at a very heavy price. We get really penalized for calling for such boycotts, yet we do it because it's our moral obligation. On the first question, if the vision for peace is not a two-state solution, what is it? The Palestinian BDS movement does not take a position on one state versus two states. This might sound strange, but in fact, as a huge coalition, the biggest coalition in Palestinian society, it is impossible to agree on anything beyond the three rights, and the occupation, and apartheid, and the right of return. Anything beyond that, you'll have a storm of disagreement, because Palestinians disagree on almost everything, especially two states versus one state. The majority of institutions that make up the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the BNC, which leads the global BDS movement, in fact do support some kind of two-state solution. But in the BDS movement, we do not take a position. Our position is that whatever solution is reached to fulfill the right to self-determination, it has to accommodate, at the very least, ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and the rights of refugees. Without that, it cannot be a just, and therefore it cannot be a comprehensive or enduring peaceful solution. Each one of us has his or her opinion about what constitutes a just and ethical and enduring peaceful solution to this conflict. But as I said, in the movement, we do not take a position. On the second question about the Gandhi Peace Award ceremony yesterday at Yale University, I think that went very well. I personally dedicated the award to every activist in the BDS movement around the world, because I think we all collectively deserve this honor. And I dedicated the monetary part of the prize to 5 organizations in this country that inspire me: the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, Jewish Voice for Peace, Black Lives Matter, National Students for Justice in Palestine, Friends of Sabil North America. Did I skip one? Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Okay. And of course, it was quite an honor to receive an award that was given to Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Eleanor Roosevelt, among many, many others.
I'm not familiar with a lot of the details you offered about that case that you brought up. I will say I'm unequivocally opposed to violence against civilians. And I would also offer that it seems that the nature of the question was intended to be a gotcha kind of question. And I think that, you know, the selective focus on the much smaller proportion of Jews and others who are being killed as opposed to Palestinians is extremely indicative of the kind of attitude that doesn't allow to see the full humanity of Palestinians. And to go back to what Omar was talking about in the previous question, in the last round, the importance of making sure that we're talking about being aware of the power dynamics between occupier and occupied, and that there's a difference between living under occupation and being the occupier, and that unfortunately a lot of the sort of focus on these sorts of incidents ignores the vast power differential and the absolutely daily violence that Palestinians encounter, both in terms of being killed, in terms of being tortured, in terms of being imprisoned, in terms of freedom of movement, in terms of lack of access to education, lack of access to health care, and lack of access to their basic fundamental rights.
Okay, I think I'm going to take the first question that I think, if I understand it correctly, and I think your question is about social justice movements and how we understand ourselves in relation to the future and our aspirations. And I think that social justice movements, by definition, are always reaching for something and envisioning something that is difficult to attain. If it were easy, we would run for the Democratic Party and nomination and, and work with them. And so I think the very notion of a social justice movement is working for social transformation. And so I think we can't always see that in our lifetime, but I think it's still something that we reach for and we hope for. I didn't think that I would see the end of apartheid in my lifetime, but I was very happy, obviously, that it ended. And I fundamentally believe, and I have not been deeply involved in the Palestinian struggle for years as these two have, but I really have seen a real shift even since I went to Palestine in 2011. And I believe the tide is shifting, and I see more and more people who are coming down on the right side of this issue. And I think this is fundamentally a moral issue. And I do not think it's something we can simply stand by and not speak out about.
I'm not completely sure this answers your question, but I think it goes to your question and also to the gentleman's in the back. I mean, I think, again, from my particular vantage point, I've been told, it's sort of interesting, by a few different, usually older generation Jewish activists who don't agree with my politics that I'm not paranoid enough. That comes up over and over. And so basically their point is that the lesson that I should be learning from Jewish history is that I need to be more paranoid, and that Jews just over and over again have been victimized and oppressed, and that therefore unless I act more paranoid, and by me they mean Jewish Voice for Peace, unless we're more paranoid, that we're going to be destroyed. And my answer to that is always, first of all, that they're clearly going to lose, but that also that we don't know what the future holds, and that given that we don't know what the future holds, it's very, very important that we work from a sense of hope and from a sense of optimism and a sense of acting from our aspirations and our dreams and our ideals rather than from our fears. And that as we live in according to our fears, we are never going to see the world that we want to see, as you described it, Premilla, that we need to be able to act from our hopes and our dreams. And I'll be the first, and if we find out that we're wrong or something changes, I'll be the first to stand in line to defend us or whatever we need. But in the meantime, it's very, very important, given that we don't know what's going to happen, that we work from our hopes.
To respond to the gentleman in the back regarding the polarizing effect of BDS on campus and the controversy around BDS, I've been called a controversial speaker, and that's one of the reasons why Columbia and Barnard tried to restrict access to this event to the general public. I think any speaker who's not controversial would be so boring that only 5 people would attend his or her lecture. And from a philosophical perspective, I truly believe that controversy is essential, not just important, essential for the development of intellectual discourse, for the movement building. It's extremely important that we don't speak the same language all the time, that we listen to diverse opinions, we debate, we get challenged, and we challenge others. That's controversy, and that's positive. But going back to your point, does supporting Palestinian rights mean denying everything about Israel, denying Israel's right, what you called Israel's rights? The BDS movement is very simple in its platform. We call for ending occupation, ending a system of racial discrimination that even the US State Department has called a system of legal societal discrimination, and the rights of Palestinian refugees in accordance with international law. What part of those is such a disaster to support? Our basic rights under international law. We're not calling for destroying anyone, for killing anyone, for denying anyone's rights. The movement believes that every human being deserves equal rights, regardless of their identity. It cannot get simpler than that. We're opposed to all forms of discrimination. It doesn't get more moral than that. As to the question on anti-Semitism, it's a very important question. I think anyone who argues that they oppose BDS because it's anti-Semitic, and it is anti-Semitic because it opposes Israel, which defines itself as the sole Jewish state in the world, and so on, is making an anti-Semitic statement, because they're conflating Israel with all Jews around the world. This conflation is an anti-Semitic statement. There is no all Jews. Anyone who says all Jews are, whatever comes after are, is making an anti-Semitic statement. Jewish Voice for Peace just published an anthology, a book titled On Anti-Semitism, where I proudly wrote a chapter. I argued very clearly that there is nothing Jewish about Israel's system of oppression and apartheid, and therefore, since there's nothing Jewish about Israel's oppression of Palestinians, there's nothing inherently anti-Jewish about opposing Israel's system of oppression.
Can you go first? Yeah, in terms of the question about intersectionality, I absolutely think the question of the franchise is a really important one, taking money out of politics. Overturning Citizens United, which I don't think is going to happen with our new Supreme Court justice. And I think the question of electoral integrity reaches far and wide. It's beyond just money in politics. It has to do with the way in which convicted felons have been disenfranchised in a number of different states. It includes the way in which the electoral boundaries have been redrawn over the past 30 years or so. So I think there are multiple ways we have to think about the ways in which we can wield power in this country. I think it's harder and harder to do so through electoral politics, which is part of the reason why I think social movement organizing and activities such as BDS is so incredibly important, because in fact it's very difficult for us to make change through the electoral system.
On the first question regarding Gaza and the role of Egypt in the siege, we have to make a distinction between a partner in crime and the criminal. According to the United Nations, Israel is the occupying power in Gaza. So opinions do not matter in this. This is the official position of the international community, that Gaza is still part of the occupied Palestinian territory, and the occupying state that is responsible is the state of Israel. That does not mean that the current right-wing dictatorship in Egypt is not responsible as well. Of course it is a partner in Israel's crime, but it's just that, a partner in crime. The real criminal remains Israel's occupation. The question in the back about how can we say Israel is an apartheid state because it discriminates against Palestinians, while we ignore what you called apartheid in Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. One crucial difference: Palestinians are indigenous to Palestine. They're not indigenous to Jordan and Lebanon. Apartheid is not a matter of opinion. In 1973, the United Nations developed a definition in the International Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, and in 2002, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court evolved that definition. So there's a very clear international definition of the crime of apartheid. A UN agency, ESQA, just weeks ago came up with a very damning report that showed that Israel is practicing apartheid. So there's no question that Israel is guilty of apartheid. The question is, can we call the Lebanese state discrimination against Palestinian refugees a form of apartheid? It is, of course, a condemnable form of racist discrimination against Palestinians. No human rights activist can ever defend how the Lebanese state is dealing with Palestinian refugees and other states in the region that you mentioned, rightly. But does that constitute apartheid? Again, it's not a matter of opinion. This is a very clear legal definition. Systematic racial discrimination by one racial group against another in an area where both groups live, where both groups belong. Palestinians, as I said, are indigenous to Palestine. So the state that's currently discriminating against them by law, not just by policy, is the State of Israel, where more than 60 laws discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel simply because they're not Jewish, not to mention the endemic discrimination against Palestinian refugees who are not allowed to go home, and against Palestinians in the occupied territories through very clear, very explicit apartheid policies, settler-only roads, and so on and so forth. So it's a very clear legal distinction here between racism and racist policies in Lebanon, Jordan, and elsewhere, and apartheid as practiced by Israel. On the last question, strengthening relations between Palestinians in the diaspora and Palestinians in Palestine, that's a big one. I cannot reduce it to a 60-second answer, but I think one important point that comes to mind is that the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, has lost a lot of its credibility because it has not been representing Palestinians in the diaspora as much as it once did. We need to rebuild the institutions of this the biggest national institution for Palestinians, the PLO, so that it becomes representative, it becomes democratic, and it regains its legitimacy by representing all of us. Those who count Palestinians as only those in the occupied territories, ignoring that more than 62% of the Palestinian people are not living in the occupied territories, are really trying to reduce the Palestinian people to a size that fits the Oslo agenda, that fits the agenda imposed on us by hegemonic powers. And we should oppose that first and foremost. Establishing direct connections between feminist Palestinian groups in the diaspora and feminist Palestinian groups in Palestine, various labor groups, teachers groups, student groups, and so on, direct relations are extremely important in rebuilding internal Palestinian democracy, to revive, to regain, to recapture our national institutions, take them away from the corrupt, for lack of a better word, so-called leadership that's currently hijacking them.
Wanted to give a shout out to some of the people who are co-sponsoring our event, because this event would absolutely not be possible without them. So this event is co-sponsored by Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies, Anthropology, Middle East Institute, Columbia Queer Alliance, Divest, Barnard for Just Transition, Student Working Solidarity, Mobilize African Diaspora, Arab Students Association, No Red Tape, Barnard Columbia Socialists, South Asian Feminist Alliance, African Students Association, as well as Answer Coalition, ADADA New York, JVP NYC, and the New York for Palestine Coalition. Just thank you all for coming tonight. Just a quick pitch: if you haven't yet signed our petition, help us BDS. The link is up here. You can also find a CUAD member at the front with their laptop. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you for coming tonight.